Tonight's speaker is the Honorable Paul Hillegonds, who will examine what he thinks the next 50 years will be like in our wonderful state and the Midwest. So this is a structured and linked series of speakers. I think tonight's speaker, with his experience in all kinds of aspects of planning for Michigan's future, one of our respected colleagues looking forward for our state. We will have a very wonderful time thinking about together what it looks like coming forward for the state. I'm going to let Matt McLogan do the formal introduction, though, of our speaker. Matt is Grand Valley's Vice President of University Relations and has been a longtime acquaintance of Mr. Hillegonds. He will introduce him tonight, and also he'll be serving as the moderator when we have a question and answer period after. So please welcome Matt to the mic.
Good evening. Thank you so much for the privilege of being able to welcome our speaker this evening. Before I begin, I want to recognize three members of the legislature who've joined us this evening. State Senator Mark Jansen, Representative Bob Janetsky, and Representative Frank Foster. The latter two are graduates of Grand Valley State. We're so proud to have them serving in the legislature. Could I ask them to stand and be recognized? Paul Hillegonds, a distinguished former trustee of Grand Valley, really doesn't need an introduction. We know his wonderful service on our board as state representative, Speaker of the House, head of Detroit Renaissance, and now Vice President of DTE. What I'd rather do is spend a minute or two talking about some things you may not know. Paul, state representative from Allegan County for 18 years, in the mid-1980s, became minority leader of the Michigan House. Not always a great job. And at the time, Paul took the helm in his caucus, a low water mark for Republicans. You needed 56 votes to control. The Republicans had 42 seats. It's a long stretch. And when it's 56 to 42, the 42 can be ignored. Paul Hillegonds managed that caucus in such a way that not only was it not ignored, it was soon discovered by the folks who ran government that the best ideas and the best suggestions were coming from his caucus. Bit by bit by bit, Paul led that caucus to parity. And in 1992, election morning, the Republicans had won 56 seats. Paul was on the cusp of becoming Speaker of the House. Then a funny thing happened on the way to the forum. One of those seats was subjected to a retabulation, and lo and behold, it was won by the Democrats, and so it was a 55-55 tie. It fell to Paul and his opposite number, Curtis Hertel, the Democratic leader, both of whom dearly wanted to be Speaker of the House all alone, to figure out how to make the enterprise work with a tied House. They did. And for their consummate skill in doing so, they were both collectively named the two best legislators in the United States in 1993. In 94, Paul got the brass ring all to himself and served as Speaker for 2 years. And when he voluntarily left the legislature, his successor, Curtis Hertel, put it perfectly. He said, "We shall not see your likes again. You are the best there is, there was, there ever will be." And I agree completely. Please welcome Paul Hillegonds.
Thank you, Matt. That was very kind. It does bring to mind a story. It wasn't always nice and bipartisan in the period leading up to shared leadership. In fact, I recall a night when I had returned from a long day. Nancy was fixing dinner, and while dinner was being served to our then 3-year-old, Sarah, the phone rang, and it was our attorneys who were advising the House Republicans on what we should do about a Democratic proposed rule that said if you can't resolve who takes power in the next legislature, the caucus with the majority in the old legislature gets to continue on. And so as I was on my end of the phone conversation with this very painful discussion, dinner was being served, and what I didn't know was our 3-year-old Sarah was listening. And so when I hung up the phone, she asked, "Daddy, are Democrats people?" And I said, "Yes, Sarah, Democrats are people." And she said, "Are they bad people?" And I said, "Sarah, they are very, very bad people." And then she asked, "May I hit them?" And Nancy intervened at that point. But happily, we did come together, and it was a wonderful 2 years. I came into this tonight with a lot of trepidation, but I need to start by telling you how grateful I am truly to be here. This is like returning home in many ways to extended family, and in addition, I have family here. I'm grateful that my mom is here, and my wife and best friend Nancy, but also extended family, some former Grand Valley Board and legislative colleagues, and just members of the university community and the West Michigan community who I've known a good long time, including present legislators. Thank you all for being here tonight, and happy birthday, Grand Valley State University. Preparing for the evening, I sought the counsel of Detroit's most esteemed demographer. I asked him the question, did he use census data from previous decades to predict a region's future? And his answer was an unequivocal no. He said to me, the future isn't determined by data, measuring regional trends. The future, he said, is shaped by people. How individuals and institutions use their gifts, their assets, to tackle present and emerging challenges. And that really framed for me some of the things I'm going to say tonight. First of all, I thought about Grand Valley's history over the past 50 years, and particularly 30 years ago when I was a second-term legislator. And at that time, not only was the field house roof falling in, literally, but Michigan's economy was tanking, and a growing state budget deficit had led some policymakers in Lansing, and Matt will recall this, some policymakers to ask the question, should the young state college planted in the fields of Allendale be closed as a cost-cutting measure? And when you think about that and what we have today, it's truly an incredible story. And I would dare say that even those who defended Grand Valley in that time 30 years ago couldn't have foreseen at the time the magnificent campuses in Allendale and here in Grand Rapids, the robust enrollment, and the educational excellence that today are vital regional assets and state assets. That is, no one could have foreseen that except for one visionary college president, a small band of dedicated trustees, administrators, and faculty, and a handful of community leaders. They made the difference. And the Grand Valley story has been repeated really over and over again here in West Michigan. I think of Grand Action's strategic focus on healthcare and research, and now a medical school. Healthcare now ranking as Michigan's largest private sector employer, with 77,000 more workers than in manufacturing. I think of the preservation of green space in core cities like Detroit and Grand Rapids, and the concern about fragile dune areas. Grand Rapids, West Michigan leaders have been very involved in saving some prime dune area in Saugatuck of late. The corporate and civic commitment to sustain and enhance cultural institutions and programs. The West Michigan Strategic Alliance focus on economic and quality of life measurements to track the region's progress. And the economic development efforts of Right Place and others to connect this region to what today is a global and green knowledge economy. That all said, I'm not discounting the contributions of our manufacturing sector. Though the days when Michigan's economy was dominated by high-wage, low-skill manufacturing jobs, those days are ending. We still enjoy the benefits of a 100-year manufacturing legacy, driven largely by auto manufacturing here in Michigan and regional success stories like the office furniture industry. In the early 1900s, a number of small electric companies were the seeds from which Detroit Edison, now my employer, DTE Energy, evolved. One of those companies was Edison Illuminating. They hired a chief engineer who was skilled at working with engines. In his spare time at that electrical plant in Detroit, he would routinely tinker with a little gasoline engine he had built. The engineer's interest in engines and automobiles began to consume more of his time, and so his boss at Edison Illuminating pushed him to choose between working with electricity or autos. The plant manager's name was Henry Ford, and he chose the automobile. A company in Holland, where I worked as a college student some 40 years ago, employed about 250 people at that time. Today, the company operates worldwide with a workforce of 7,500 employees. It was started by a family friend, a Holland High School shop teacher who also liked to tinker. His idea was to build movable walls or partitions, and his name was Jerry Hayworth. All of this to say that the history of the region and our state has been all about people with vision, who innovate and take risks and build on assets. And our 50-year future will depend on today's and tomorrow's visionaries, innovators, and risk takers. Maybe it's time to sit down with Matt and take questions, because the truth is, I can't predict whether or how work on an idea presently underway at this university, or in a Van Andel Institute lab, or on an advanced battery production floor will transform this region or the state over the next 5 decades. And with the lightning speed of advancing technology, most of which I don't understand, but my kids sure do, I certainly cannot predict how our jobs and everyday lives will change. The only thing I can say, it's safe to say that for all of us, learning will be a lifetime requirement as we adapt and adapt again to the explosion of applied knowledge. So instead of doing a lot of specific forecasting about what the next 50 years hold for West Michigan, permit me to share the conclusions of a report researched and written by a nonprofit group called Michigan Future. Entitled A New Agenda for a New Michigan, the report addresses ideas about how we can shape a better future for the regions of our state. What prompted it was the economic reality that we face today, and that's a decade-long downturn that reflects structural, not cyclical change. In other words, many of the 435,000 high-wage, low-skill manufacturing jobs lost in Michigan since the year 2000 and have been eliminated or exported elsewhere will not return. This is not to imply that advanced manufacturing in the state has no future. It does, but a recent Detroit Free Press article described well the change already underway, and I quote, "Michigan's advanced battery industry is reaching critical mass on both sides of the state. But job seekers need engineering degrees and experience for more technical jobs, or a manufacturing or skilled trades background for production work. Walk around a lithium-ion battery plant, and it's easy to conclude the nation would need thousands of these operations to offset more than a fraction of the nearly 5 million American jobs that disappeared. There's more automation than people. The key question driving the Michigan Future study was, what really matters as we work to position Michigan and its regions for success in a knowledge-based global economy? Michigan Future Executive Director Lou Glazer, U of M economist Donald Grimes, and those of us, including Milt Rohr, with the Fry Foundation, who are still serving on an advisory board for Michigan Future, identified the most successful regions in the country. We tried to learn what distinguished those regions from our Michigan regions. We read a lot, collected data, and talked extensively with thought leaders in and outside of Michigan. And this evening, I'm not going to focus on the data supporting our findings. You can access the full report and updates validating the data on the michiganfuture.org website, and I encourage you to take a look. Our starting point of the study was this important premise, and I quote, "In a world where technology and globalization are driving fundamental structural change in the U.S. economy, Michigan's slower job growth has not been caused by the loss of manufacturing jobs. The entire country is losing work done in factories. Michigan is lagging the nation because of our slow growth in the dynamic, high-wage sectors of the knowledge economy." So we asked ourselves, what are the characteristics of high-prosperity, knowledge-based state economies? First, we concluded that state economies can best be understood not as political jurisdictions with boundaries by municipality especially, but rather as a sum of their regional economies. Second, prosperous regions are distinguished largely by what they export to the rest of the nation and world, goods and services, but including what is sold to tourists, retirees, students, and patients who come from elsewhere. Third, what distinguishes successful metro regions are significantly higher concentrations of knowledge-based industries and the proportion of adults with post-secondary, undergraduate, and advanced degrees. And finally, prosperous regions generally are anchored by vital core cities that attract highly skilled workers. Now, think about that. Through the lens of these high prosperity characteristics, we have lots of challenges in Michigan, where too often Detroit versus outstate regions or cities versus townships have trumped regional economic strategies, where what we expect or what we export to the rest of the world, even today, remains highly dependent on an auto-related manufacturing sector that will continue to adjust to global economics and ultimately smaller market share. Where racial divisions, politics, and sprawl have resulted in educational decline and economic and social disinvestment in most Michigan core cities. These challenges aren't a Detroit-only problem. In 2008, of the 55 U.S. metro areas with populations of 1 million or more, Detroit ranked 33rd in knowledge-based industries concentration, 36th in per capita income, and 37th in college attainment. But Metro Grand Rapids lagged even more, ranking 54th in knowledge-based industries concentration, 53rd in per capita income, and 45th in college attainment. So what matters most in turning around these measures and better positioning Michigan regions for success in a knowledge-driven global economy? Our conclusion was and remains talent. In what columnist and author Thomas Friedman has described as a flat world where work can be done anywhere on the planet, economic development priority number one we believe, is to prepare, retain, and attract talent. We also concluded that this focus on talent requires a rethinking of our strategy to grow Michigan's economy in the coming decades. The results of our rethinking are 6 priorities we believe will expand Michigan's talent base and therefore the vitality of our regions. First priority, and not necessarily in the order of importance, build a Michigan culture aligned with a flat world. More important than legislative policy changes are the attitudes and beliefs of Michigan families about how to get ahead in a world of constant change. That the old Michigan economy worked so well for so many of us is now really a barrier to our future success. In an age when economic growth is driven by knowledge and innovation, the most prosperous regions are those that highly value learning, an entrepreneurial spirit, and being welcoming to all. The evidence is that Michigan is having trouble with all 3. One measure of learning is our ranking of 34th of the 50 states in the percentage of adults with a 4-year degree. Now, it's true that one of our state assets is the presence of more engineers per capita than anywhere in the United States. But over the past 15 years, Michigan has become one of the leading exporters of college-educated young adults. The just completed U.S. Census tells us that 21 to 34-year-olds make up 17.5% of our state's population, compared to over 19% nationally, and that the trends are we're becoming a less populated, older state. Survey research also indicates that too many parents, if you can believe this, in a poll a couple of years ago, over 70% of those surveyed did not believe there is an essential link between post-secondary education and their children's job prospects in today's economy. That is a problem. Entrepreneurial spirit that launched great automobile, cereal, furniture, pharmaceutical, and chemical enterprises based in Michigan over time has been replaced by a mindset that employment is less about risk-taking and more about an entitlement to long-term, well-paying jobs. I was interested in the quote in the newspaper last week by Michigan venture capitalist Chris Ryzik, who recently described this phenomenon as an employee mentality culture as opposed to an owner's mindset. Ryzik recalled interviewing an engineer who was employed by an auto supplier for a position at a young growth company just recently. He noted that the engineer's questions were, and I quote, all about vacation, healthcare benefits, and 401k plans, and not about the venture's growth prospects. Beyond this anecdote is the Small Business Association of Michigan Foundation's well-researched 6th annual entrepreneurial scorecard that ranks and rates the economies of all 50 states. In 2010, measuring entrepreneurial growth, vitality, and climate, Michigan ranked 45th among the 50 states in overall entrepreneurial dynamism. And then we also fall short in our embrace of diversity. Projections are that by mid-century, American society will have become an even richer tapestry of race, ethnicity, and religion, with Caucasian Americans realizing minority status. Yet, we in Michigan remain one of the nation's most racially segregated states. This segregation is manifest by where we live and by the wide gaps in our family incomes, educational attainment, even our health status and life expectancy. We cannot legislate a change in these cultural challenges, but we must address more openly cultural barriers to the reinvention of Michigan's economy and work intentionally to become more welcoming. In the Plymouth-Canton area, where our family lives today, the Michigan Roundtable for Diversity and Inclusion, a nonprofit organization, recently launched a series of community conversations about our area's fast-changing ethnic and racial mix. At the first meeting that I participated in, Those of us who are white described our towns with self-congratulatory adjectives like accepting and inclusive. But the tone of our conversation changed as we listened to the results of focus groups of minority students in our schools and ethnic newcomers in our neighborhoods. What we heard were stories about racial harassment and stereotyping in school corridors and classrooms. Stories about police pullovers for no other reason than the driver's skin color triggered suspicions. Eventually, we turned as a group to the hard questions. Could we truly be an inclusive community if governing boards, school staffs, and public safety forces did not begin to reflect our growing diversity? This is a hard process. It's still underway, a work in progress, but at least we're talking about it. Another initiative I'm excited about is Global Detroit, an effort to boost legal immigration in metropolitan Detroit. Why? Research by Global Detroit shows that 37% of foreign-born state residents have earned a 4-year degree, compared to 24% of non-immigrant Michigan citizens. Nationally, immigrants are nearly twice as likely to start a new business as non-immigrants. We are a nation and state that have been built on waves of immigrants, bringing their dreams and energy to our land. And prosperity over the next few decades, I believe, will depend in part on our state keeping its doors of opportunity open to all. Hard to predict where we're going with this, but I think it's an imperative. Second priority, empower new leadership. Transforming Michigan's culture will occur more rapidly if we invite into our regional leadership structures those who represent the change we are trying to achieve: the young, the well-educated, the entrepreneurial. And here's an example of why this needs to be a priority. In a 2010 Crain's Detroit Business survey of readers listing the 25 most connected leaders in Metro Detroit, I couldn't help but notice, but none were associated with new economy businesses, and all but 2 were in their 50s or older. The listing reminded me of a regional strategic planning meeting held by the Detroit Chamber a couple of years ago. A number of us at that meeting reviewed survey data indicating that attracting and retaining young professionals should be a high regional priority. The survey also registered overwhelming pessimism about the region's future, except in one demographic group: the 24 to 35-year-old professionals had optimism for Southeast Michigan. So as we reviewed this data, I looked around the room of some 60 regional leaders and observed there wasn't a single person among us under the age of 40. In contrast, consider the example of Art Prize, the incredibly successful event showcasing art and culture here in downtown Grand Rapids, an event that was conceived and organized by Rick DeVos and 20 and 30-somethings who utilize social media to attract and connect talent and visitors to this region. We need to multiply that example and seek inclusion of new and younger leadership in our quality of life and regional economic development initiatives, particularly entrepreneurs and those who are working in knowledge-based enterprises that compete nationally and internationally for talent, those who know firsthand what we must do better as regions to attract talent. Third priority, align K-12 education with a knowledge-driven economy. As a nation, we've expended so much effort to improve schools over the past decade, but there really is no clear set of reforms with a high probability of success. Yet, if we are ever going to narrow the gap between rich and poor, between educated and uneducated families, we must insist on accessible, quality pre-K through 12 schools across our regions. And I say pre-K because, in fact, learning begins at birth. Scientific evidence is overwhelming that most of a person's brain development occurs in the first 4 years of life, and that those who experience nurturing and learning during infancy will be better prepared to succeed in school. When looking at competition between regions, those metro areas that are funding expansive pre-K learning programs, especially for disadvantaged children, will likely have the most solid learning foundations necessary to retain and attract talent in the years ahead. Grand Valley's own Board of Trustees Chair, Kate Pugh Walters, is one of the community leaders of a Grand Rapids Regional Early Childhood Coalition. The coalition First Steps aspires to provide a medical home for every child, make home visits to assist new parents, and coach child care providers outside of organized centers. The early childhood effort underway here, I believe, is a model for other Michigan regions and bodes well for the quality of life and economic competitiveness of West Michigan in the years ahead. As for K-12 success, we at Michigan Future found no evidence of a strong correlation between the amount of spending on schools and better student achievement. It is also clear that the form of school governance does not predetermine performance either. There are successful and mediocre public, publicly chartered, and private schools. In the end, our report concluded that reform efforts must include how we educate and reward educators. We need to attract, develop, and hold accountable and reward with merit pay teachers and administrators who have a passion for preparing students for the flat world, who instill in children a love of learning and the ability to be curious, adaptable, lifelong learners. And because children today are wired differently for learning, have different ways of learning, we must make available more school and learning path options for our students. Priority 4, invest in education first and foremost. This is what Bill Gates recently told the National Conference of State Legislatures, and I quote, "Take the two big leading industries, biology and medicine. That's one, and computer technology, that's two. The job creation and success for those industries have been overwhelmingly in locations where there is a great university. There's an almost perfect correlation between the number of jobs in a region and the strength of universities." As Michigan Future assessed the assets Michigan presently possesses to prepare, retain, and attract homegrown, national, and international talent, our higher education system, both universities and community colleges, was at the top of our list. If you question this, try to imagine the future of Grand Rapids in the next 50 years without Grand Valley State University and the other higher education institutions located here. Unfortunately, after decades of building a world-class system, more recently, Michigan has been underinvesting in our universities and community colleges. Over the past 10 years, state funding for higher education has been cut by 27%. Michigan is now 42nd among the 50 states in per capita support, reflecting the fact that higher education has been a less important state priority than prisons and tax cuts. The Michigan Future Report calls for a restoration of our commitment to higher education, but in a manner that reflects the number of students enrolled at each university and the research funds they attract. This funding allocation would reward the success of schools like Grand Valley while recognizing the important role of our research institutions. Today, Michigan universities bring in more than $1.5 billion of federal research dollars annually and employ thousands of knowledge workers. In addition, our research universities are major attractors of talent from around the world. In short, Michigan's future economic health is tied to our investment in higher education. Priority 5, support export-based business investment. Higher education graduates are not likely to stay in Michigan if job opportunities are not available. To grow businesses that export goods and services to consumers from other states and the rest of the world, Our report recommends a state business tax structure with a broad base and a low rate. As Governor Snyder describes the strategy, let's focus on gardening, nurturing the businesses that are expanding here in our state, rather than emphasize hunting or trying to woo out-of-state businesses to Michigan by throwing expensive incentive packages at them. Not that incentives aren't important, but we can't depend entirely on incentives in our tax structure. Second, state and local regulations need to be minimized and streamlined to encourage competition and innovation. And finally, state government should not try to concentrate all of its economic development efforts on trying to choose the winners, those industries of the future to invest in. Our report concludes that a better idea than overly prescriptive state investments is to support basic research at our universities and nonprofit research institutions and push them to drive commercialization efforts, and then support emerging businesses with competitive taxes, reasonable regulation, and talent development, retention, and attraction policies. Sixth priority, build regions that are attractive places to live. You probably have read or heard about Richard Florida's book, The Rise of the Creative Class. In it, he credibly advances a theory that young professional new economy workers seek first urban centers that are alive with diversity, culture, and other quality of life amenities, and that knowledge-based businesses seek the places where talent settles. Well, whether it's jobs that attract talent or talent that attracts jobs, or more likely a combination of the two, the fact is today's fastest growing regions have vital core cities where young professional workers live, learn, and play. Too many of us are losing children to places like Minneapolis and Chicago. This is why private foundations in the state and business groups like Detroit Renaissance, Grand Action, and the West Michigan Strategic Alliance have been so focused on school reform, loft housing, transit, arts and cultural amenities, attractive public gathering spaces, and the commercial businesses that follow in our core cities. It is also why we need a renewed federal and state commitment to urban policy strategies designed to create more livable, sustainable cities. A corollary to the 6 priorities I've just listed is the role of taxes in a public investment strategy. If we are not able to legislate needed change from an entitlement culture to a learning, entrepreneurial, welcoming culture, neither can we simply tax cut our path to prosperity. In the past dozen years, state and local taxes in Michigan have been reduced by what is now over $6 billion annually, moving Michigan to a tax burden around the national average. Government spending, more than $7 billion below the Headley constitutional limit. When I was in the legislature, we were at that limit. Now we're $7 billion below. And state general fund revenues that are 42% less in inflation-adjusted dollars than when I left the state house 14 years ago. But here's the thing. Lower taxes and spending have also been accompanied in our state by lower and slower economic growth. So I did state earlier that the business tax burden must be competitive with that of other states. At the same time, tax policy should not undermine our ability to support the human and physical infrastructure necessary for talent-based economic growth. So expenditures on priorities like higher education, early childhood learning, the quality of life amenities such as green space and greenways, good roads and convenient public transit, and vital urban centers with thriving arts and cultural life are all really important, I believe, to our next 50 years. Michigan's future analysis of extensive tax and economic data found that most successful states are not characterized by low taxes. If anything, The successful states tend to be higher taxing states than lower. And on the other hand, states with the lowest taxes tend to have lower per capita incomes, lower concentrations in knowledge-based enterprises, and lower proportions of adults with four-year degrees or more. Again, I quote Bill Gates in his presentation to the state legislators. The industries that I think about the most, information technology and biological industries, are more sensitive to the quality of talent in a location than they are to state tax policies. We all would like Mississippi's taxes and Minnesota's social and economic infrastructure, but there is no state in the nation that has both. So which fiscal strategy will we choose? There you have the essence of our report, a new agenda for a new Michigan. It's not an agenda that will be easily accomplished because moving from an entitlement to an entrepreneurial culture is surely economically, socially, and politically very painful. But believe it or not, I still remain an optimist. What lies ahead for West Michigan and the state? I am hopeful that we will continue to treasure our stunningly beautiful and bountiful land and water resources, our world-class institutions of learning, healthcare, and research, our rich heritage of culture and the arts, the importance of our core cities. I am hopeful that our quality of life, vitality of central cities, and competitive business climate over the next 50 years will succeed in retaining and attracting talented people and growing innovative companies. Companies like those in the fledgling clean energy sector. Today, that sector employs 23,000 Michigan citizens. Not a lot in the overall scheme of things, but interestingly, it ranks us in the top 10 of the 50 states in the clean energy sector. I hope that we'll finally find a way in the next 50 years to consolidate public services, reduce the number of Michigan's school districts, which number 553 today, and local governmental units, which number 1,800 today. And I hope in doing so will inspire greater citizen confidence and self-governance at all levels. And my wish is that we will become more welcoming to all and celebrate the diversity of cultures and ideas without losing our common purpose as communities, a state, and a nation. What I do know is that Michigan's vitality, its quality of life and prosperity will depend on a willingness to take risks, to change, and to think longer term than a short-term election or economic cycle. That change begins with us, the aspirations we hold for ourselves and our children, and the aspirations we hold for our state and regional communities. I also believe that the successful reinvention of Michigan regions will depend not only on our personal values and an innovative private and nonprofit sector, but on public policy and the community investments we make. Investments in the assets necessary to keep and attract talent and grow a knowledge-based economy. So I'll close where I started with the same wise advice of my friend, the demographer, but on a more personal note. Our daughter, Sarah, is now 21. She's a beneficiary of one of Michigan's assets. Last year, as a junior at the University of Michigan, Sarah signed up for the school's Detroit semester. She lived on the Wayne State University campus, participated in urban studies classes, and interned at an amazing job training and human services organization, Focus Hope. At the end of the term, Sarah and her classmates reported on their internship experiences to a group of teachers and parents. We were there, Nancy and I were there. The intern stories were a mixture of humor, sadness, and triumph. Stories really of idealism bumping up against the painful realities of urban poverty. After their presentations, the students answered our questions. When it was my turn, I asked them, after what you've experienced in Detroit, Are you optimistic about the city's future? And if so, why? Following what seemed like a long, awkward silence, a voice in the back of the room answered, I am optimistic. What the negative newspaper stories and television newscasts don't cover are the wonderful people I've met. People who are working every day to improve their neighborhoods, their city, their lives. Here's the rest of the story. As I turned around to hear that beautiful response, I realized the voice of hope was Sarah's. In that moment, our daughter reminded Nancy and me that the next 50 years will depend on each of us and how we decide to engage in the defining and building of our future. Thank you.
Paul, thank you for that terrific address. We have about 15 minutes remaining for questions from the audience. And microphones are around, so if you would like to ask a question, please raise your hand. But I'm going to barge in with the first question. At the beginning of this decade, the state's general fund was a little over $10 billion. Very soon, in this year, it's going to be about $5 billion.
Yeah.
Another way of describing that is that the state this year will be doing half of all the things it did at the beginning of the decade. Do you believe that the citizens of the state understand it that way and that they're willing to accept a significantly smaller state government?
We shall learn the answer to that very quickly. The problem for our legislature, it's not that our elected officials don't talk about what state government does, but the last time I looked at the numbers, about 70% of the tax revenue collected by the state goes right back out into the communities through other vehicles. Medicaid goes to healthcare systems and physicians. State aid for universities goes back through the universities and community colleges, K-12. And revenue sharing, another big part of the budget, goes back to municipalities. And I'm not sure that our citizenry makes the connection between what we send to the state and what we receive back in services. And I believe this budget that will be announced tomorrow will make us much more aware as we see cities lose revenue sharing, and a number of cities in Michigan face, I believe, what will be receivership. As we see tuition levels go up again because higher ed is cut, and the governor said he won't cut Medicaid, but I'm guessing that there will be reduced Medicaid services that people are eligible for.
Thank you. Okay, Dr. Jellema.
Thank you very much. You mentioned in your presentation the importance of longer-term thinking instead of shorter-term thinking.
Yeah.
One of the things that relates to the legislature is I would call it shackles of the term limits that legislators have. In my interactions with neighbors and friends and people I just happen to talk to, nobody's complaining about how legislators are around too long. I don't think it's a big issue. What do you think are the prospects of the term limits being eliminated so that people that take a few years to get good at their jobs can stay in their jobs?
I spoke too quickly. That was Dr. Schaub. Sorry.
Thank you for your question. I hope that term limits are eliminated or at least lengthened considerably, but I'm skeptical that they will be soon. It would require a vote of the people, and the national term limits group that spent an inordinate amount of money to have term limits passed back in when was it, 1992, I believe, is still around and will spend a lot of money to defeat a change in term limits in the state. And so And again, this is one where I'm not sure citizens have made the connection between the impact of term limits on the legislature and the outcomes. One of the outcomes is less longer-term thinking, for sure. But the other outcome, which is far worse than I ever anticipated or predicted, is the loss of relationships that are built over time, and the trust that's built over time between people of different parties, different regions. The legislature at its best is a place where it's not only representative, represents the diversity of the state, but you learn constantly and grow in your job. And 6-year term limits in the House and 8-year term limits in the Senate really cut off that growth just when it has the opportunity to be a part of important problem solving. Not that problem solving can't be done in the current legislature, but I think the incumbent legislators today work under much more of a burden than I ever did.
Paul, do you find it odd that voters still support term limits in the 70th percentile in polls, but 37 of the 38 members of the new state Senate all served in the House? Is there a disconnect?
Yeah, there's a bit of a disconnect. And those who, very few incumbents are defeated still. It's those who are elected tend to serve the full length of time. The other thing that's, the original argument that I think was the strongest argument for term limits was that we would start to elect citizen legislators who were coming out of their communities and jobs and would quickly return to those jobs and never become professional politicians. I really think the opposite has occurred. As soon as people arrive in the legislature, my observation is people start thinking about the next political position. What leadership position am I going to run for in the caucus? How can I position myself to run for the Senate or even run locally? There's much more focus today on politics than there was, I think, before term limits.
Next question. Senator Jansen.
Mark Jansen. Paul, you just hit it dead on. That is very true, what's happening right now. Kind of follow up on the term limits, though. You've talked about a lot of big changes, but underneath the term limits, because of that, I'll say, inexperience and those desires of some of the legislators, taking on these big issues can be a challenge. Besides the legislature, where are we going to find some of this leadership coming from? Where do you see that coming from? And how do we accomplish some of these big issues? Because the legislature no longer is what I saw when I walked in '97. You and folks that had 30 years of experience, that's not there anymore. So where are we in Michigan going to find some of these answers into the future?
Well, increasingly, as state government shrinks, I think public officials hope that the private sector will step in, and to some extent that is occurring. Not only do you have the kind of leadership that Grand Rapids has enjoyed over the years from privately held companies, but public corporations are getting more involved in community building and longer-term issues through corporate foundations. But the big change I've observed is the role of private foundations. I sit on the Kresge Foundation board, and it makes every year, we send out about $150 million in grants every year, and $30 million of those grants are in Detroit. And the foundation, along with other foundation partners and in growing numbers of corporations, have started to do some of the things that you've enjoyed here in Grand Rapids in terms of community building, the kind of quality of life focus that will be necessary to attract talent. That said, I keep saying this to our foundation board folks, we need to be engaged in conversations with the public sector, because think about it. Kresge's second largest foundation in the state, over $3 billion endowed funds, and we can put out about $150 million a year. But $30 million in Detroit a year is a drop in the bucket compared to the importance, for example, of revenue sharing and some of the other ways state government touches an urban area. The state is not able to simply withdraw from its part in building our future. Yes, we will rely more on the public or the private and nonprofit sectors, but government still needs to be involved in thinking longer term and making investments.
Next question, Mr. Chapla.
Rick Chapla, your 3 reasons why we should be optimistic about the future of the city of Detroit.
Yes. One, I told the story about my daughter because she represents an amazing phenomenon occurring in the city of Detroit, and that is that for all of its problems, there are a growing number of young people that want to live and work in Detroit and are beginning to do so. And what does that bring to the city? It's not only new talent and ultimately more entrepreneurial energy, which is beginning to occur, but also an appreciation, a celebration of diversity. I mean, one of the greatest barriers to Detroit's future has been our racial history. And young people aren't hung up on that. And so that's reason number 1. I would say reason number 2 is the importance of higher education in the city. Wayne State University is going to be an anchor for growth, and in fact has set up an organization called TechTown that is working on commercializing research and getting entrepreneurial businesses going in the city with some really intriguing success. And the third issue that gives me hope is world-class healthcare systems and their role, much like here in Grand Rapids, in job creation and talent attraction. I just talked about private foundations. The Hudson Weber Foundation in Detroit has looked at those assets, and they have set up what is called 15 in 15. Their goal is to attract 15,000 young professionals to live in Detroit for the first time by the year 2015. And they're well on track to doing that. And why is that? They're not only supporting housing projects, bike paths, quality of life amenities, but they have worked with the anchor institutions, Wayne State University and 2 healthcare systems, Henry Ford and DMC, who are now offering incentives to their employees to live or rent in the city. And they also have set up purchasing programs to support entrepreneurial businesses that are growing in the city. This kind of strategic approach is working in other cities, and it gives me hope. Are we going to change the neighborhoods of Detroit and the school systems in Detroit overnight? No. But you have to start somewhere, and in Detroit there is the Woodward Corridor. And by the way, public transit is part of that equation. That will be in a couple of years, surface rail, light rail. That corridor, I think, will bring back people into the city and the young professionals and ultimately the jobs that will turn around the city.
We have time for one more question. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I just have a question. You mentioned technology, biology, and talent several times.
Yeah.
As far as the advances in those fields and the state's needs, what do you think is the most beneficial degree to the state of Michigan right now for students to be earning, considering that you said 24 to 35-year-olds are most likely to change the state of Michigan?
Yeah. Yeah.
History.
Yeah. And I would not, I was a political science major. I would not recommend that. I think actually, if you force me to choose, I would say engineering is going to be critical, healthcare, anything in the healthcare field too. But when you think about it, for the future of Michigan, one of the great assets we have is our manufacturing legacy. And one of the talent, one of our attractors of business in the state right now is the pool of talent we have in the engineering field that is no longer working in the automobile industry. So for example, General Electric has moved a major research plant into Wayne County near the airport, and they're exploring alternative energy and some of their other new lines of business which have great promise of growing in the state. Why did they settle in Wayne County? All the unemployed engineers. But here's the thing about engineers in Michigan, and I'll use DTE Energy where I'm employed as an example. In the next 10 years, 40% of our workforce, many of them engineers, will be of retirement age and leaving the company. Our ability to continue to attract new lines of advanced manufacturing and engineering will depend on engineering talent. And I think that's a great field of opportunity in addition to healthcare. If I had to choose two, those would be the two.
Matt, we actually had a tie for the final question, so this gentleman assures me it's a short one.
I'm Chris Shea. You sing the accolades of Grand Valley State University and other colleges and universities in the West Michigan area, but yet you point out that we're behind other areas in the percentage of four-year graduates.
Yes.
Are we simply late getting out of the blocks, or are there other significant dynamics there?
Well, I think the dynamic is we're still dealing with a cultural problem. We'll get over it, I think, in a hurry because economic reality sets in. But that survey I mentioned, that over 70% of parents didn't think higher ed was essential to their child's job future, that's really about a long legacy of manufacturing-dominated economy where you could leave high school with not a lot of skills and certainly not a 2-year or 4-year degree and make very high wages. And we haven't gotten over that yet. We are beginning to get over it, but this is why I spent a little time on public policy. Having served on 2 boards, Grand Valley and Wayne State University, during these times when we've been cutting our state support to education, there really is an inverse relationship between level of state support and tuition. And just at a time when more people are going to need higher education in the state, it's going to become increasingly unaffordable for exactly that group of citizens and families that haven't valued higher ed in the past and will value it now.
Paul, you've given us much wisdom and much food for thought. It was a privilege to hear you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you all.
Thanks.